So thank you very much for coming for this side event. So first of all, we have a short presentation about the work made by French companies around the water, managing water and water footprint. And we will show you just afterwards a concrete example through a case study to a new methodology and tool which has been developed by the energy sector and especially by EDF. So I leave the floor to Jean-Pierre for the presentation of the EPA new works.
Yes, good morning to everybody. Jean-Pierre Maujean, I'm a Sustainable Development Deputy Manager of Suez Environnement, but I'll speak today on behalf of Entreprises pour l'Environnement, APE, replacing my colleague Annabelle Princojean, who couldn't unfortunately attend to this session. EPE, Entreprises pour l'Environnement, is a French partner of WBCSD, World Business Council for Sustainable Development. It's a company which it's a coalition which gathers more than 40 France-based companies operating at the national or international level. You will see some companies belonging to various sectors: steel, aluminium, automobile, chemical, cement, energy, environment, insurance, utilities, and so on and so on. And during this event, I've got the pleasure to make what we would call in French an avant-première. It's a presentation of the brochure called Measuring and Managing Water, which has been published by APE. I think we've got a leaflet on your seat presenting this brochure. This brochure will be presented in France on the 22nd of April by Mr. Jean-Louis Chaussade, the CEO of Suez Environnement and member of APE. And I've got the pleasure to present it to the World Water Forum in avant-première. It will be of course, available on our website, epe_asso.fr, as I remember. So, what's the point? The point is the water is more and more important issue for the companies, for EPE members, and also for all companies, for two reasons. That water is more and more included in the risk mapping of the companies, and the trend will be more and more influenced by global change, by climate change. But at the other end, managing water with all the local stakeholders, NGOs, communities, local authorities of the territories, has become a basic commitment of corporate social responsibilities, policies of the companies in terms of involvement to the local development. And that's for these two issues that we have. When I say we, it means companies, but also our local stakeholders. We have to measure and to manage water, implementing local water management action plans, which will, I'll say it one more time, gather all the stakeholders of the territories. So in this brochure, there are two things which are explained. There are two types of tools. There are measurement tools in order to gather data on a common basis, to share data and to share the same approach, the same constatations on the state of water at a local level. And after that, we have to implement action tools in order to set up together, to launch together local action plans involving all stakeholders. two actions, but measurement is the first action, and two types of tools dedicated to these two actions. So I will just remind you, the objective of the EPE working group, which was launched in 2010, and this working group gathering more than 20 companies belonging to EPE. First of all, made a feedback of the experiences and the existing tools used by the companies member of EPE. After that, gave a recommendation of the best way to measure water, to measure the water footprint, but also to implement local action plans. Gave a selection of tools without giving any comments of this tool, because there are several tools which are more or less adapted to local situation, though there is a whole toolbox of tools. And after that, gave some recommendation for implementing local actions. So, I will give you some examples of existing tools used by companies. First of all, we've got identifying and anticipating risks and opportunities tool, and risk mapping tools. Risk mapping is based on a collection of local data, and very often there is a lack of data concerning water. A lack of environmental, but also economic data, because as water is very often not very expensive, it isn't taken into account, and the difference, for example, for data concerning energy consumption, there are often on the local site operated by our companies a lack of environmental and, of course, financial data. And concerning the risk mapping, we can mention several tools. There is a very well-known WBCSD water tool, water risk filter developed by WWF. We could also mention the WIX, WIIX, developed by Veolia. Concerning measuring the water footprint, there are three types of data which can be collected: volume, quality, and value data. And concerning economic data, as I mentioned, there is a lack of economic data, but there is also a lack of methodology in order to transform pricing into value assessment. Very often the price of water is not reflecting reality. There are only treatment costs, investment costs, so CapEx and OpEx, and the value of the cubic meter saved for the whole community, for the whole territory, is not very often assessed. So, as I said, a good indicator is an indicator which has to be, of course, based on science, reproducible, but also credible and recognized by all stakeholders of the territory. We have to enhance the trust on knowledge concerning water between all the stakeholders, and that's only if we succeeded in setting up, in implementing this trust, that we can discuss about the action plans. Some example of action and monitoring plans. There are some tools from reporting to decision making. There are very interesting tools of dialogue with stakeholders in order to share the expertise between the company and all the stakeholders. For example, Bayer, which is mentioned, developed dialogue tools between the company and the farmers. The farmers using the chemicals produced by the company. And there are some existing tools developed mainly by the company dealing with energy, EDF. I think Laurent will explain more about it, and GDF Suez as well. So, the issues which has to be handled by these tools are normal issues of water consumption, of water discharge, of impact of the water discharge to the environment, but there are some emerging issues which has to be taken into account, like, for example, adaptation to climate change, resilience, facing extreme climate events, impact of health and biodiversity as well, as biodiversity quality and quality of water are very often linked, micropollutant, and of course, the link between adaptation and mitigation. It means the carbon content of the water which is used by the company. So, in the brochure that I hope you will have pleasure to read, there are several examples coming from the companies belonging to Entreprises pour l'Environnement, to EPE, and of course, we stay all at your disposal for any question right now and after your reading of the brochure. Thank you.
So thank you very much for this interesting presentation. And I think the publication will be available on the website next week, so after the official launch in France. And so I think it is a good introduction to the presentation we will make now together with Jan about the Water for Energy Framework. So this example is quoted in the new brochure of the EPE. And so this initiative has been launched at the World Water Forum 6 in Marseille in 2012. And we have presented, and we will present today, the result of this 3 years' work with international stakeholders, and the idea will be precise. So first of all, the presentation, so just a quick overview of the project background, the presentation of the methodology, example of interest, current status and way forward, and especially the presentation of a concrete case study of an application of this methodology. So to be quick, the project background, as you know, water is a major risk for humanity, as stated by the World Economic Forum this year, as a main risk for the humanity. Water and energy nexus has been outlined by the World Energy Council in 2010 in a paper. Water issues concern all energy sectors, so it's why this project is dedicated for all energy sectors. And because energy companies face multiple water-related risks in terms of quantity, quality, and others. And there is a growing expectancy from external stakeholders, local community, local administration, and also agencies and institutions. So why to develop a framework for the energy sector? Mainly because we have local needs in terms of water use, because you cannot produce energy without water. So you have water input in your process, you have water consumption, and you have net discharge water. So you have question of quality, you have question of quantity. So the local need can be different, but one of the need is to evaluate and monitor simply how water users interact locally. So we really have a local approach in the past, now, and in the future. There is a need to follow the long-term trends, and especially the global change and the climate change issues. There is a need more and more to communicate locally on site interaction with water, to demonstrate and to be transparent about our water use. And the need for evaluation in the future. It's linked to the long-term trends. And the need for raising internal and external awareness on this growing topic. So for a corporate point of view, at the global scales, the needs are also different. It could be to have a kind of global overview of our portfolio and to define the priorities we have to put on. There is a need for corporate reporting and communication, of course, on this issue more and more, corporate awareness too. And it could be also useful to have a tool in terms of study, and especially for feasibility study for a new site, for instance. And it could be an opportunity to set water management targets at the global scale. So the problem is that no existing methodologies. There are a lot of initiatives and methodology, but when we analyze the different methodologies available on the market, there was no methodology which was really fitted for the energy sector and which take into account properly the local water capacity. And so there was a consensus among the major energy actors to try to answer to these needs. And so W4EF initiative was launched in Marseille in 2012 at the last World Water Forum. And it is supervised by the World Energy Council and the World Water Council, and led by EDF, and with the participation of 30 to 40 international stakeholders, university institutions, energy actors, NGOs, and so on. And the mandate was very clear. It was to develop a common terminology and methodology to estimate the energy sector's interaction with water anywhere in the world. So it means that you need to have a flexible methodology for that. And the first point is also to have a common terminology, because we often talk about water use, water abstraction, water withdrawal, and so on. And at least for the energy sector, to have the same terminology and to talk the same language. So the major principle, you have 10 major principles, so I will quickly pass over through this principle. But the first one is really to distinguish and to take into account quantity and quality, to really take into account the local situation and the appropriate time step, because often you have global average annual value, but for water you know that you have a seasonal variability, and to take into account this variation is very important. Output should reflect the type of water. If you use seawater, if you use fresh water or brackish water, it's not the same. And we have tried to avoid to have one single oversimplified indicators, but a set of indicators. It is really important also to define the relative effect of your process, of your activity locally, and the shared responsibility, as we discussed this morning in the session of multipurpose use of water in a hydro reservoir. Both positive and negative effects should be taken into account, because if, for instance, you store the water during rainy period and you release this water during dry period, you can bring positive effect. So local and intra-annual variability has already been said. It should be flexible if you want to be able to use it for all energy sector everywhere on the planet, in Africa, in Australia, in a tropical area or in a cold area. You need to have a flexible tool. And these local indicators should be able to be aggregated over spatial and temporal space, in order to be sure that we can have a kind of aggregated results at the regional or global level. So the general philosophy is really to take into account the local with the site water use, the local hydrology and local limiting factors, which can be physical, technical, or regulations, when you mix all these three components, you can have three types of indicators, what we call the water use indicators, water interaction indicators, so what will be the interaction with the ecosystem and the human needs, and water situation, which means what was the situation with and without the activity to demonstrate the relative effect of the site. So, in fact, we divided this framework in three modules. The first one is the access to water, the second one is the interaction with the water ecosystem, and the third one is the interaction with other human needs. So just, yes, I can switch to Jan for the presentation of 2 or 3 simple indicators just to demonstrate the usefulness.
Okay, thanks. I'll stand, if you don't mind, because it's more interactive and better. So the first interesting point about this framework, it really makes the difference between water withdrawal, water input, and water consumption. And that's a major difference to be made, in which it's not always made in current documents. So what's water withdrawal? Water withdrawal is really the water which is required by the process to be carried out during the time step. Okay, therefore it's a risk for supply. It will be treated in module 1. Water consumption is the change brought to the water body. It's the withdrawn water minus the consumed water, the returned water, sorry. And that's likely to generate an impact. So it's considered in modules 2 and 3. And if you have just a quick example of what it could look like, the difference for a fictional thermal power plant, you can see that the blue bars, the blue sticks are water withdrawal, the green sticks are water consumption, and there's a huge difference. And of course, if you're speaking about water withdrawal when speaking about thermal power plant consumption, you're making a huge mistake. So now just coming back to the different needs Laurent defined earlier. So there's a need locally to be able to evaluate, monitor the different forms of risks for operation, and especially for communication with local stakeholders. So here, let's say we've got a plant, any kind of energy production site, really, consuming a certain amount of water, and we would like to know, well, this consumption of water, is it a risk for the human needs? And we can have an indicator, which is basically this one, use fraction of human availability, where we compare consumption to the available water minus what should be left in the water body to supply downstream users. So this gives you an idea of the fraction of the water you may consume before it's considered you're having an impact on downstream users. It's interesting, you can follow it on a monthly time step. On a weekly time step, it's your choice. The time step is your choice. You carry out the calculations over the time step you want, and you can carry it out over several years. So you can see dry years, for example, 2013, wet years, 2014. Another interesting interest of the W4EF could be for prospective studies. So here we've got a certain net thermal load emitted to the river. This is not the effect, it's a use of water. Depending on where that use happens, the effect will be different. So first of all, you have to estimate the generated effect, so delta temperature. The delta temperature generated by the emission of a certain amount of terajoules. And here, let's say we're in module 2, right? And we want to look at the risk of effect this delta temperature is having on the ecosystem. And here we're having a prospective study. So we're comparing the delta temperature, so the change brought to the water body, we're comparing this to an acceptable change being the difference between the ecosystem requirements minus the upstream temperature. And here we're having the results for 2014, and we could also have the results for 2034 if we consider that in 2034, the upstream river temperature would have increased plus 3 degrees. So you can see, well, today, the light green bar, no problem. In the future, we still have kind of an important margin here, so the red line is critical. We still have an important margin here, but the ratio is a bit increased because the river temperature has increased. So it is a potential issue for the future. Another indicator, another interest could be for feasibility studies, as Laurent mentioned. Here we've got a new production site, a new production process we want to set up. And we've got the choice between 2 locations, 1 and 2. 1 is a small river, 2 is a bigger river, okay? And we want to see, well, which location fits the best for my new site, taking into consideration ecosystem-related issues. And, well, basically you can have these kinds of graphs where we compare the ecosystem requirement to the available water, so the stress without us, and the stress with us, so the ecosystem requirement divided on available water minus our water consumption. And you can calculate this for location 1, you can calculate this for location 2. First of all, you can see the relative effect, the difference between the two sticks, the relative effect of the activity. We see that basically in both situations we're not adding important stress, but we can also see that in location 1, the pre-existing stress in light green is quite high, whereas in location 2, the pre-existing stress is quite low. So if we had to choose where to set our new production site, only considering water, of course, we would better go for location 2. We would then need, of course, local impact assessment, very pushed studies, because this is just a first screening tool. And the final interest could be, well, if you've got several production sites, right? Here we've got several production sites which are withdrawing a certain amount of water for their process. So this is water withdrawal. It's in module 1, supply risk. Well, we may want to see over, let's say, a year, which site is the most exposed to supply risk. And here we can have just these kind of results. So it's comparing water input to available water. And here we can have the results for the 3 different production sites, basically seeing that there's no problem for production site A and C, very light blue and dark blue, and it's production site B, which could be some kind of risk during the summer, even though we still have a 30% margin. That's interesting locally, but at the global scale, it could be interesting to have an output which, let's say, aggregates all the results and which is more easy to understand. So here we've got the different sites. We've got 36 figures, 3 sites, 12 months, 3 times 12, and we can sort these different values out into different categories. So very low risk, medium, high, well, overuse, which is very bad. And you can sort out the 36 values we've calculated into these, and then compile the results in some kind of chart like this, where basically it's simply obtaining the percentage of situation in each category. And so at the end of the day, we can easily answer this question, which is, in 2014, did I face any potential physical supply risks over my production pool? Where we can see that 90% of the situations are okay, completely secure, 10% are a bit more risky. And if you want to see where, we can go up to this graph and see that it's production site B during the summer, for example. Okay, to finish this general presentation, so we've got a first draft version of the framework of the tool available. We can test it. We have to test it on different case studies to try and improve it. Therefore, we need some kind of a phase 2 with improved stakeholder involvement. What for? First of all, to improve visibility and credibility at the international level, so that this tool really comes out as the energy sector's tool to estimate local interaction. We also need additional technical development. There's still work to be done. And finally, we would need some kind of sectorial adaptation process to adapt the general framework to the specificities of each sector. That's it for the first part. Laurent?
Thank you, Yann. So we will continue with a concrete example on a hydropower case study in France. So this power plant is located on the Google map in the east part of France. So in fact, you have, maybe it will be easier. Yeah. So you have the Lemon Lake at the Switzerland, and so the Rhône River here. And you have the Vallée de l'Ain, which is a tributary of the Rhône River. And you have several power plants in cascade, with the first dam, which is Vouglan Dam, a big dam, and 4 small dams just below. And after the flow will flow into the Rhône River. So this is a picture of the dam. So the reservoir is quite long. 35 kilometers long, with a 130 high dam. This is the 3rd largest hydropower reservoir in France, with 600 million cubic meters of water storage. The annual production is 300 gigawatt hour. Nominal capacity is 300 megawatt just for the first one, and with 4 turbines with a capacity of 300 cubic meters per second. And in fact, we have this big reservoir and 4 small reservoirs, so it means that the 4 downstream hydropower plants are operating as a runoff the river flow. We have no real storage, and it means that if you use the turbine of the Lac de Vouglan, Vouglan Lake, you have to turbine the water in the 4 other power plants. So the storage and the management of water is really done in the first reservoir. So in terms of local constraint, we need to release downstream flow for environmental reason, and the environmental flow is 2 cubic meter per second. But from February to April, we have taken extra regulatory engagement to ensure 28 cubic meter per second downstream for fish reproduction needs. So it's not compulsory, but it is a commitment EDF made locally with the local stakeholders. And in summer, we also have extra regulatory commitment to maintain the level of the reservoir for tourism activities at 426-27 meter high. So we made the calculation for all the 5 reservoirs, but we will present, for question of simplification, only the main one, because the other one are neglectable in terms of global results, so we really focus on the first one. Where maybe I can switch Jan to the details of the presentation now, because it is really linked to the details of the calculations.
Thank you. Okay, back for the technical aspect. So here, we've carried out the calculations for the quantity indicators, not quality indicators, for this first test over the whole system. Calculations were carried out between 2011 and 2013 on a monthly time step, okay? And what's quite interesting is that 2011 is considered as a dry year, and 2012 and 2013 are normal years, wet years. So it's interesting to see if the results will reflect this difference. Here we go. Simplification. So for this first presentation, and as Laurent said, as the impact of the 4 intermediary reservoirs is quite neglectable, we've chosen to present the results only for the interaction between the big reservoir Vouglans and the river. It's in fact mostly the interaction between the whole chain. And as Laurent said, there's 2 main constraint factors for the operation. First of all, ensuring a river flow downstream, more or less high, depending on the month. And second, ensuring the water level in the reservoir for touristic activities during the summer. So, water use, first of all. So water use, you've got, first of all, water input. It's the water which is being turbined to produce power. And here you see that basically, and of course we can expect this, the water input is really correlated with the power production, so generally during the winter periods, okay? We see that 2011 we produced less power, basically because we turbine less water, basically because there was less water available in 2011, a dry year. So, the other water use indicator, which is interesting, is consumption. So first of all, you have to look at the consumption on the river, because you may be impacting the river, and river consumption is the difference between the downstream natural volume, so you need to recalculate the natural volume without the reservoir, and the current volume. That's the difference. For the reservoir, it's basically the change in volume stored during the month, for example, so output minus input. And, well, at the end of the day, for river consumption, you get something like this. So you have river consumption and reservoir consumption. And of course, when you've got river consumption, you have storage in the reservoir. So it's not water which is consumed overall. It's water which is stored, right? So these volumes are the ones you have to consider in an impact assessment study, because these volumes are the ones missing from the river or the reservoir because of your activity. However, the overall consumption, you need to sum river consumption and reservoir consumption, right? And what we found out is that when you sum these 2 figures, you always come back to net consumption, net evaporation. What is net evaporation? It's the difference between the evaporation, the gross evaporation, which occurs currently, and the natural evaporation from the reservoir, basically the evapotranspiration by the surface now drowned. And so, if you sum the volumes we've calculated in the previous slide, you get something like this. Okay, so it's very different from what we can get like gross evaporation. Here, basically, you've got a lot of months during which net evaporation is even negative. Okay, this is really specific to Vouglans. It's not a result which can be considered as reflecting for all hydropower reservoirs, but in the case of Vouglans, we are actually producing water compared to the natural situation. Once again, it's really Vouglans. It's not in a tropical area, etc. There's being a case study operated in Malaysia. There's another in Quebec. So we'll see the difference between different kinds of climates. over the year, which is quite interesting, you see what, first of all, these are the stakes which show the consumption from each water body. So in 2011, we've stored water in the reservoir, consumed water from the river. Overall, this is the net evaporation. So it's the volume missing from all water bodies because of our activity. It's negative. 2012 and 2013, we were consuming water from the reservoir, emptying the reservoir, and storing supplying water to the river, in fact. And so overall, these are the figures you have over the 3 years. And you see here that net water consumption is always negative. So we've produced 10 million cubic meters of water over the year. Rough evaporation is 15, 16, 16. So there's a huge difference. For this site, once again, it's site-specific. And all in all, when you compare cubic meters per megawatt hour, if you compare rough evaporation or net evaporation, you don't have the same result at the end. We consider that the net evaporation is really the global figure you should consider for the water missing because of the reservoir. However, it is not the volume to consider when estimating impacts. Impacts on the river, impacts on the reservoir are related to the specific consumption from both water bodies. And we'll see this with the indicators, right? So here's one indicator for module 1, access to water. Well, of course, for hydropower, turbining using 80% of what's available is pretty good. So it's a different analysis compared to if it was thermal power plants, where using 80% of what's available could be a kind of risk. So here what we compare is the water input, so the turbine every month, to the potential availability. Potential availability being the stock of water plus the input minus the evaporation minus other user consumption. It's all the water available to be turbined and to produce power. And, well, here we see that for Vouglans, every month, we don't turbine that much water available. It's normal, we've got a huge storage, okay? So every month, we have a huge margin remaining, and if the operator was asked to produce more power, he could have. However, over the year, these are the annual figures, where we only count once the reservoir volume available in January. We see that the operation is pretty optimized. We're using around 80% of the volume available. The 20% remaining is basically the volume we've kept in the reservoir. Okay, so conclusion for this. This is one indicator in module 1. We've got 5. This is only one. What we see is that over the 3 years, we've always have an important margin in terms of operation. We're only using a small margin of what's available. Over the year, you have something like this. And if you look at the final results on an annual basis, you see that the system is optimized because, well, we're using 80% of what's available, which is normal for hydropower. Once again, it's good to be turbining what you can. So first result for module 1, an example of indicator. Let's see module 2. Interaction with the water ecosystem. So how does our activity interact with the water ecosystem? So here we're looking at consumption, right? It's not input anymore, it's consumption. It's the volume missing from the river because we're storing water during some periods. And so we're comparing basically the consumption to the acceptable consumption. Acceptable consumption being the natural volume minus the volume we should leave for the ecosystem. The volume which should be left for the ecosystem is generally 12.3. It's regulation. But as Laurent said, during a few months of the year, the local operator has engaged, but it's extra regulation. It's not a constraint. It's not compulsory. Has engaged to leave 28 cubic meters per second in the river. So at the end of the day, you have this kind of results, which shows you what fraction you've used of the available consumption, okay? And so basically during 2012 and 2013, there's no problem. All the negative results are for months during which we've supplied water to the river, which can be considered as positive effect for the river ecosystem. And during the other periods, we haven't stored a large amount of water. We always have quite an important margin. In 2011, however, the situation was more tense, as I said, and we'll see this in the next slide. And, well, during 1 month, in April, it appears that we have stored a bit too much water compared to the 28 cubic meters per second we should have left for extra regulation engagements. However, as Laurent said, we also need to remember that in the same time, we need to store water to ensure the level during the summer. So it's a kind of a complicated balance to ensure. If we look at the stress which existed with and without us, that's important. We see that 2012, 2013, there's no existing stress. Generally, during the summer, where there is a risk of stress a bit higher, 60%, we are supplying water to the river. So, in fact, we're reducing that stress. In 2011, here again, we see that the pre-existing situation without us was already very tense. In fact, you can see here that without us, we wouldn't have met the 28 cubic meters per second in the river. And in May, in fact, our management of the plant allowed the 28 cubic meters per second to be met. It's not the case in April, where, as we've seen, we had a negative impact. So basically, if we sum the results by aggregating the different situations, we see that during normal years, wet years, there's absolutely no problem. We have very small effect, or even positive, the green, and we can see that the situation without us, the situation with us, we are improving the situation. In 2011, dry year, we see it's a bit more complicated to ensure all activities, to ensure the river flow downstream, the touristic activities, and our proper operation. So basically the conclusion is that if dry years occur more often in the future, it could be quite difficult to maintain all activities here. But during normal years, no problem. Okay, module 3 is basically the same, so I'll be able to go a bit quicker, but this time we're looking at human activities. So the other human uses of the reservoir, touristic activities. Here we're looking at our consumption once again, but this time the consumption from the reservoir, not from the river anymore. So the delta volume we've generated on the reservoir. And here, here we're comparing what's required, so the volume required, to the reservoir volume. No, this is 1, 2, 4. So we're comparing our consumption to the acceptable consumption, leaving enough water in the reservoir to ensure touristic activities. What we can see here is basically during the month where we have to ensure a certain level in the reservoir, a certain volume, we are storing water, so we have a positive effect for the human users. In August, we've started emptying the reservoir, so we have kind of a positive risk indicator, but we always see that we are under the red line. So we're emptying the reservoir, but ensuring that there is the level of water required in the reservoir for touristic activities. Once again, in 2011, dry year, we've had a bit of difficulty to ensure this level. We can see that in May, when we supplied a lot of water to the river to meet ecosystem requirements, well, we didn't really participate in ensuring the level for touristic activities during the summer. So it's a complicated balance to meet during dry years. When we compare the situation, the stress with and without us, what can we see? For normal years, the situation without us, of course, is stressed. If we weren't storing water, there wouldn't be enough water in the reservoir for touristic activities during the summer. So we're having a positive effect here, and you can see that in 2012 and 2013, we've always met the request, the requirement for a certain volume. It's always under the orange, and thanks to us. So that's a positive effect. In 2011, even though we tried storing water, you see that the difference between the situation without us and with us is, shows that we have a positive effect. We didn't manage to ensure that level in the reservoir. We showed that because it was a very, very dry year. Okay, I'm coming to an end. Here, you really have to understand the colors correctly, right? Orange is good. Orange says we have no problem. So what can you see once again is that in 2012 and 2013, we've had positive effects, and the situation without us would have been stressed. The volume in the reservoir would not have been met, and we've allowed the level to be met both years. Okay? In 2011, it was a bit more complicated, but we see that basically the situation without us was all red. We've improved it 1 month. We didn't manage to improve it all the months. But it's not regulation, so no problem. It's more sustainability, reputation, stakeholder engagement. So all in all, to conclude, these were 3 indicators we proposed, right? And at the end of the day, if you look at all the outputs we propose, which can be chosen by the user depending on his needs, we can see that overall, between 2011 and 2013, we've turbined this amount of water, and this means that we needed 4,600 cubic meters to produce 1 megawatt hour. This is specific to Vouglans, of course. Consumption, we've consumed 30 million cubic meters of water from the River Ain, and we've stored -40 to the reservoir. So all in all, we've produced 10 million cubic meters of water. It's negative consumption. This reservoir is producing water compared to the natural situation, right? So all in all, we have a figure which is minus 12 cubic meters per megawatt hour. If we had used gross evaporation figures, we would have 19 cubic meters per megawatt hour. So it's kind of a difference. Once again, it's not this value which is important for risk of impact assessment, it's the consumption from both water bodies. And overall, Module 1, access to water, the Vouglans operator had important production margins regarding physical availability, technical availability, and regulation. We always had very important margins every month for the production. However, annually, the power production was optimized. We really used as much water as we could while respecting regulation, considering our technical and physical constraints. For modules 2 and 3, there's no past or future real issue concerning downstream river users. No problem. We've been able to show that. No past or future issues concerning the reservoir's ecosystem. We've considered that there's no real reservoir ecosystem to be maintained on the reservoir, not on the river. However, we've been able to see through the results that should dry years occur more often in the future, it might be difficult to ensure the current environmental flows, the current level in the reservoir, and our power production operations. This could be a difficult challenge if dry years are to occur more often in the future. I think that's it. Thanks for your attention, and if you have any questions, we'll be pleased to answer them with Laurent.